The authors of Heartbroken, next on City Corner. Thompson, and welcome to City Corner. The opioid crisis has taken over the country, affecting Americans from coast to coast, including right here in the St. Louis metropolitan area. A new book written by local authors takes a look at not just the history of opioid addiction in the United States, but also the distinct and diverse journeys experienced by 7 families who've lost their children to drug addiction. So today, there are 3 authors to this book, but I'm joined today by 2 of those authors. They're here in studio, and I want to welcome Diana Cuddyback and Matthew Ellis. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have your book here on set, and I want to say this just was released this year, so congratulations on just an enormous amount of work that went into this, and congratulations on the book. Now we shift to a more serious topic and talking about something that every day we hear a story about, tragically. But I want to maybe start things off really, let's set the stage with the book, which is how did this all actually come about?
Well, I run the Heartlinks Grief Center at Family Hospice, and our book started because I had a parent who came to me and was attending one of our other groups, but she had lost her daughter due to a drug addiction. And while she felt loved and cared for in the group, she felt there were things she couldn't talk about. So we started a group that was called an addiction loss group for people who have really gone through that journey as a part of the process, and then they lose their person. So that's how it got started. And in that, we wanted resources for people. And we couldn't find any resources. There was 1 or 2 books, but not much. So after the group went for a while, we decided to create our own book that answered some of the questions that people in the group have on a regular basis.
And then Matthew, you're an epidemiologist, you're at Washington University. How did you get involved?
Actually, it just was happenstance. It was a friend of a friend knew Ellen, who is the primary author of the book, and put me in contact with her, and we'd had a cup of coffee and some conversations, and so she asked me to come in and kind of be their opioid expert as they built this book, and it was an incredible experience.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about how do we really delve into this topic and talk about it, and I think there's that part where I'm always about as I use the term setting the stage, but to take a step back, because people always hear opioid, they'll maybe hear heroin, fentanyl here and there, but let's just, before we delve into this and really get into the book and the families and who you sort of profiled, I want to start with you, Matthew. Tell us, let's just lay it out there, when we're referring to opioids, what are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about a class of drugs that does encompass, on one hand, a lot of prescription drugs, your typical Oxycontin, your other oxycodone drugs, Percocet, Vicodin, hydrocodone drugs. There's actually a large range of prescription opioids that range in sort of their potency. We're all familiar with probably morphine is a very common one. But then on the other end of that scale, we have other drugs, more illicit drugs that are illegal, such as heroin, and what is now fentanyl. And what's interesting about fentanyl is that although it was a prescription drug and is a prescription drug, it's often prescribed to terminal patients or cancer patients that have advanced pain that require a more potent drug. But until recently, we've had this influx of illegally made fentanyl that has been produced very cheaply, primarily in China, starting to flood our country. And that is what's causing this massive spike in recent years in overdose deaths.
And I should note too, in some of this stuff, obviously in your book, you mentioned where it's the potency of this drug, that fentanyl is, what is it? It's much more.
It's about 50, it can be 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin or morphine, yeah.
And again, I know you both work in this area, and this might seem like a silly question, but again, for those listening to this, really to understand it, what exactly is sort of the, essentially, for lack of a better term, the high that sort of experience? Like, what is the sensation from that? Is it, obviously when you're prescribed it for painkillers, it's to numb the pain.
Sure.
So how does that sort of correlate or combine with on the addiction process? What is it, the sensation that you're feeling?
Well, so it's a supreme high. So you're just kind of losing all sense of reality.
Okay.
And the reason that fentanyl has become so popular is that as your addiction grows, let's say if you start with prescription opioids, your tolerance is going to build. So you either need more prescription opioids, or you need stronger prescription opioids, or you need heroin, which is much stronger than other prescription opioids. But then you can still build a tolerance to heroin. And then, so you need a more potent opioid. And then fentanyl is that more potent opioid. So what you hear a lot is that often when your tolerance builds, at some point you're no longer getting high from the drug. You're just trying to keep withdrawal sickness away. You don't want to get sick. And so for people who have been using heroin for a long time just to maintain their normal functioning body without getting sick or feeling bad, fentanyl was a boom. They were like, oh, I finally found a drug that I can now achieve that high I used to get with heroin. The problem with fentanyl is a lot of times we don't know how potent it is, and so it's very, very easy to overdose. Some people may take what would be a normal heroin dose, but that's lethal in a fentanyl dose.
Let's talk about, when we get into the book, these 7 families, these 7 parents, because I know when I was looking at some of the overview of the book, they range from a family who a child succumbed sadly, but just even trying one time, just trying it out. And I think that hits at Matthew's point, which is it's so potent that you actually, and it's cut into so many other drugs, you don't actually know if in that one try that you have, that might be the end of your life. Tell me about these families and some of the stories.
Well, and I think that is the story for many of these families, is that their child got the fentanyl unbeknownst to them, thinking it was heroin, and died because it was so strong for them. There are people who are using fentanyl purposefully, but it's so cheap that that's why they're cutting the heroin with it at this point. So there's all sorts of families, and I think the thing that I've been struck with most, honestly, is that a lot of times we think it's people out there, it's them, but this is just us. This is our community. These are the people next door and the kids that you went to church with or band camp. And that's what these families have faced. We have a family who had somebody in the military, and his military experience left him with PTSD, and he chose, and a habit, and unfortunately he succumbed to that habit. There's young people who just picked it up once and became addicted and then stayed with it. There's another young person who had his wisdom teeth out and got an opioid and loved it, loved how it made him feel once he no longer needed it for his pain. But it's expensive and you can't get it when you're 15. So he began his journey with heroin. So all different stories, but I think for me the biggest thing was any of us. They could be any of our kids.
No, it's true. And I mean, there's not a day that goes by really in the media where you don't hear a story. And I think to your point there, you have this idea and you do see these images and you think on the one hand, but you're right. I mean, this is really affecting a lot of kids and a lot of parents. And I mean, speaking of RISE, when I look at some of the data and notes that you have connected to the book, a 400% increase in opioid-related deaths in the St. Louis area. And I found it really interesting that a lot of that is it not attributed to St. Louis's location and just the passageway of Highway 40, Interstate 44. Tell me a bit more about that, Matthew.
It's really interesting. If you look at state maps, you might think that this is restricted to urban areas, but if you look at Kansas City, their opioid rates are far, far lower than even most of the areas in the state, and but particularly St. Louis. And so also in the southwestern portion of the state, it's really bad in those 2 main areas, not much in the other parts of the state. So you may ask yourself why, but a lot of that has to do with what people call heroin highways, which is heroin and fentanyl coming up from Mexico, and usually it travels on 44 or through the highways that go up to Chicago. And so that puts us right in the middle of this supply chain, which is why St. Louis and the Southwest regions have much greater rates of overdose deaths than other parts of the state.
I know we have some graphics that I want to throw up, and these are charged by the deaths. And as we said, the increase in deaths, when you look at, and this is your field as an epidemiologist, fighting again these connections with groups, I think we've got some of these charts are gender, this is by population. I mean, what do you, I mean, we don't have a lot of time when I say summarize all your findings, but tell us what you're sort of seeing when we look at these categories.
So this is interesting because if you compare number of deaths, the county in 2017 had 250 deaths. In St. Louis City, we had 192. And it makes it seem that the St. Louis County had a bigger problem than St. Louis City. But when you look at population rates, St. Louis City had 3 times as many deaths as St. Louis County. In particular, young black men were twice as likely to die of an opioid overdose, even though the raw numbers may say that whites are dying at higher rates. So it's one of those things where you really have to look at the data and understand it to see where we need to be focusing some of our interventions.
And I think this goes by race and then gender. And I mean, I want to really delve into this idea you were talking about, which is the stigma attached to it. I still think there is just this disconnect of people. You hear the term drugs and you hear, heroin, and people are, again, thinking this is something like under a highway and it's happening, but how this actually gets into schools and to kids, because this is really starting to affect young children even.
It is. And I think that stigma piece, for the people in our group who are grieving the loss, it's hard to talk about. People, they have had a lot of experiences even before the loss of taking their loved one to the hospital or showing up at the hospital when their loved one was overdosed and being treated poorly. But understand also first responders who've been resuscitating these people over and over again and feeling so frustrated that they don't care enough about themselves to not, to quit. It's the whole system at work. But yes, and so I think families feel quite a sense of not being able to talk about it, or embarrassment or shame. They feel ashamed for their child, but they also feel ashamed as a parent. What have I done wrong? How could I raise a child? How come they didn't turn out like the person next door who were horrible when they were kids? And so there's a lot of that is before and after a loss part of the process of dealing with it.
Do you still think that when people think about addiction that they're not looking at it as sort of a disease when we talk about like a disease of the brain?
So.
I mean, what can make
it's
people...
a choice.
Yeah,
they think of it as somebody making bad choices. And it is so much a disease, and people's brain changes when they become an addict. They don't respond the same way. When you look at their brains under like MRI or other kinds of scanning technology, their brains operate differently with the drug in them. And so when families tell me that they're sleeping with, if they have the child in their house, they're sleeping with their wallets under their pillows. They just are waiting for the call all the time. And they talk about their children. One person in the book talks about Ryan and heroin Ryan, because he's 2 different people. And they love the whole of their child, but it's hard to have that.
Well, I want to hear some more about, like in the books, the families and what they had to say. We're going to show you a graphic on the screen. This is actually how you can get the book. It's available currently on Amazon. That's where it is. You can just go there very easily and buy it. There's also this website we've put up, which is familyhospice.org. That's kind of the extension of the URL, and you can purchase it there. And then for more information, the website we've listed is the other author who is not here, but that's Ellen Croney, and you can go to her website for more information on the book. But don't go anywhere. We're going to have more. We're going to get more into the book and the topics. We're just going to take a short break, so stay with us here on STL TV.
Garden is loved by green thumbs and non-gardening types alike because you can play. You can relax. And there's always something new to experience, no matter the time of day or the season. and learn about conservation and one-of-a-kind plants. So come and experience St. Louis.
Hi, welcome back to City Corner. I'm Sarah Thompson, and today I'm talking with two of the authors of the book Heartbroken, Grief and Hope Inside the Opioid Crisis. And I'm joined by Matthew Ellis and Diana Cuddyback. Thank you again for being here. And no, you're doing a great job talking about a really hard topic to deal with, because I mean, I was even saying driving in here, it's like this is stuff that is day to day happening in our community everywhere we go, and families that are next door neighbors to people we see on the street you just do not know. I want to get back to the stigma, and I know when I again was like looking through some stuff for the book, there is this idea too that you're saying that addiction can be cured, right? There is this element. Matthew, maybe before we get into the sort of personal side of it and what we're hearing from the families, on the sort of medical side of it too, like the brain can slowly be veered off of that addiction, correct?
Sure. You know, we have medication-assisted treatment, which is methadone and buprenorphine, which are substitution treatments to sort of wean people off of opioids. But you know, the problem with that is twofold. One is that access can be very difficult for treatment. If you read some of the stories in the book, they were sending their kids to Florida just because that was the only place they could find that had treatment and beds available. So, and I think the government has stated that maybe only 10 to 20% of people with opioid use disorder actually can get treatment. And so we're woefully unprepared for how many people have opioid addiction and to treat that. The second part of that is that even though that we have these medications to treat opioid addiction, we also need to understand that a lot of what addiction is about is self-treating mental health issues, or people have life stressors such as divorce or death or losing a job. And so counseling and all these mental health issues are really wrapped up in substance use in general, and we're not doing a great job of treating that alongside of the medical component of addiction.
I think they're saying upwards of half of the people with a substance abuse disorder probably have a co-occurring mental health disorder. And if you're not treating both, then you're not treating the whole.
Yeah.
When people, I think it's interesting with the book, because you're sort of the second part of the title where we get into grief and hope, it really might feel like if somebody's watching this and they, on the one hand, there's the preventative side, right? And then there's the other side where it might be somebody that they know through church or in their family or their own child. Where is the hope sort of reside? Because this really, I mean, when I was just even researching this and I was reading on fentanyl, it's terrifying because it could just be that one time, and that could be your brother, your child, your sister that dies. So where, when we talk about hope, where do you, when you're meeting with these families and with the work that you do specifically with grief counseling, where is the hope? How do we find the hope in the day-to-day, the real sense?
Well, one of the things that we have put in the book is some prevention techniques, and I know Matthew may talk about those some more, but we really did want this book to be useful to people who maybe are currently dealing with somebody they love having a substance abuse problem. So there's a lot of ideas and specifics in there. When somebody is lost to an addiction-related death, I think the hope ends up being in finding community and finding other people to talk to about it, of not being in your house alone with it, not listening to all those, it was my fault, I should have done this, working through those together as a community, and then really sharing it so that we're talking about it. You know, stigma causes people to not discuss it. And that means that I don't go home and talk about it with my 12-year-old because I don't want them to know about that. But if we're talking about it, when the first time comes that they're offered something, then they've already heard about it. They're already going, ooh, this is scary. You know, this can lead to this. And so it's a fine balance, but I think that for my families, being in the room together, you know, I had group last night, and for them being in the room together, there was laughter, there was tears. They laugh about things that people can't imagine laughing about, and yet they look at each other and they don't feel so alone, because that stigma causes us to be alone, and it causes us to not do things, and it causes us to not fix the problem as a community.
I want to ask you about, we've got these slides that have this sort of correlation of kind of what you're alluding to, which is child bereavement, and then with drug addiction deaths. And I know when I was looking at the notes for the book, it was some of the families that you followed, the oldest child referenced in the book was 31 when they passed away, and the youngest was 23. Did any of those children who passed away, did they have children themselves?
Yes.
Okay.
So Heartlinks Grief Center is a comprehensive grief center, and we see kids of all ages. So while adults are in support, then there's groups for children. And yes, we've seen a significant rise in the number of kids that are coming because either their parent is lost to them because they're gone as an addict, or more often because there are so many deaths. We've had schools who called, and there was a constellation of 7 or 8 deaths of parent due to overdose. So we go do a group in the schools. But for us in the last couple of years, it's just increased so much. And you know, before the death happens, mommy or daddy is not the person that they were. And we have children who are finding their parent having OD'd, who are calling the authorities. I have kids who have given their parent Narcan. I can't tell you that the kind of stories that we have, and yet those kids have resiliency, and when we can work with them and not get them stuck in that story and that trauma that they've dealt with, then there's hope for them to go on and find others who are there dealing with it too, but strengthen themselves. So we kind of run the range at Heartlinks with seeing it. But we have a lot more grandparents raising grieving grandkids.
It's really a tough thing to tackle because when you read everything on, you know, we've talked for a while, I think, in the media and community with heroin and opioid use, but really with fentanyl, like it's just, it seems like it's just coming in. It's coming in from other countries, from China, from Mexico. It's here in the United States, how it's distributed. I mean, when you look at what you've done with the book, you sort of address the opioid crisis. You talk about addiction itself, grief, and then hope and prevention. In a nutshell, I mean, this is your world. You're in this day in, day out, as you said. I mean, you're in it deep with the people who are really affected about this. What do you want people to know with this book? I mean, what do you really want them to take away from this?
Well, I want them to know that there are resources, and I want them to know some places that they can go to for them, and that they're not by themselves. I think, Matthew, too, it's the stigma impacts how people get treatment.
Yeah, let's talk about that, Matthew. Yeah.
So, and stigma, you know, one thing when we set out writing this book, stigma really wasn't one on our forethought, but as we developed this book and heard these stories, we really heard how much stigma these families had to deal with and their children had to deal with as addicts. And so we kind of looked at the research, and the interesting part is that the research shows that the most powerful way to change stigma is hearing other people's stories. And that became a touch point for us for this book, and something that we see can really help other people, not just people with addiction or families involved in people with addiction, but the greater community. Because what's preventing us from really solving this crisis is stigma in terms of from all levels, from the individual level, people who see it as a moral failing, to community levels where even though you have people dying in your community of opioid overdose, people will vote against having a treatment center in their community. Or at the legislative level where it's still banned in Missouri to have needle exchanges or just things that can prevent disease and maybe overdoses. So it filters down from the top to the bottom, and we really want this to be changing people's minds and going from the bottom to the top.
Where do you think we're like losing that messaging? Because when you tell the story, I think what most people can relate to, which is if you've had any injury or a serious operation and you have that, like let's go down the path of you get prescribed hydrocodone or something like that, and it gives you a sensation. I've had had that where it'll make you tired, you go to sleep, and it takes the pain away for a few hours, and then there are just people where it will just turn into, well, let me have that again, and let me this and that. And we can kind of tell that story. I feel like in some respects, it's like it's not that we have to sort of loom on the high of it, but to really tell like, how is it that anyone can get into this? I mean, I even read an article the other night in preparation for this talking about anesthesiologists who decades ago were using their own drugs that they administer to get high just because they had access to it and they liked the high and the sensation. Do you think if we, like in our storytelling and reporting about it, or to your point, sharing stories, where should we focus those stories to get others to empathize that this could happen to anyone, and we need to have compassionate care and response in our community?
I think it's really important to go back to the brain and the way our brains work. For one thing, for so many of the children that were talked about in this book who died as young adults, they started early, and the brain as a teenager, you're at your peak learning. You have more neurons, you're more excitable, your brain neurons are more excitable, and it's also that we can learn fast. But unfortunately, we learn addiction fast. And I'm a parent of teens, and I didn't know that, you know, when I had my first teen. And I think we need to really understand that it is a brain-based thing. I think that's a place, because it also takes off the shame piece of it, the you're a bad person thing that I think happens.
Okay. Oh,
So that's one place. I mean, and certainly there's others, but I do think we have to keep talking about it as us, not them.
Right. That's a good point.
And pulling that piece in.
Matthew, we're going to add something to that as
No,
well.
as to your point, we're all in this together, and so we have to solve this problem as a community. And if we're not going to do that and separate ourselves from us and the others, then we're never going to achieve that goal.
Before we wrap things up, I mean, how do you? I thought it was interesting too when we talk about this. How do you respond, right? Which is people have the best intentions sometimes when we empathize with people and they've lost a child, but like there's this element of what to do and not to do. But again, not to kind of keep hitting at this point, but for anyone listening to this, and if they know someone, especially somebody who's lost a child, an adult child even, to drug addiction, what would you just say to them where to let their compassion show but not to offend? How do you
I think
do that?
listen. I think be quiet. I think listening is always a better option than trying to give people a lot of advice or suggestions. I say use the child's name. Look at the wholeness, the fullness of the child. That child wasn't just a drug addict. They did all these other things. And remember the fullness, because that's what people do as they go along, is they remember the wholeness of that person, and that helps them heal. One thing I want to mention that I didn't know about really until I wrote the book, Mid-America Transplant is our organ procurement organization in this area, and they're wonderful to bereavement centers. But one of the things that's happened for them is in the last several years, the rate of organ donation due to drug loss, drug-related loss, has gone up significantly, and they're really trying to reach out and make sure those families get support. It is a moment of hope, though, if you lose your child to a drug overdose, when their organs can be donated, that's really, it's helpful, you know, and I wanted to make sure I mentioned that because it wasn't something that I knew. I assumed that that couldn't be possible because they had an addiction issue, but that's not true. So that's something to be curious about.
Yeah. No, that's a really important point. I mean, there's so much information in your book, and I, again, want to applaud you for, tackling a difficult subject, but putting it into a book that really can help people and help people who are directly affected by it and people indirectly. And I thank you for being here today. Thank you so much. Thank you both. Again, we've got the information there for you on the screen. This is how you can get the book. It's Heartbroken, Grief and Hope Inside the Opioid Crisis. It's available online for purchase through Amazon, or you can head to familyhospice.org. With that URL there on the screen and purchase the book. If you just want to learn more about the book and the process of how this all came about, you can head to Ellen Croney's website. That's ellencroney.com. She is the other author who's not here in studio with us today, but who worked with Matthew Ellis and Diana Cuddyback on writing the book. Thank you again for being here. And thank you at home for watching STL TV, and keep it right here on STL TV. Experience St. Louis.